Hello and a very warm welcome to this video. Thank you for joining it. Thank you also for your enthusiasm and for your contributions below the line, many of which have proved extremely helpful towards the research. I actually want to dedicate this particular presentation to my dear and learned friend Roger Stritmatter, because as we'll see further on, it was he who actually found the very clever key to opening up a particular part of this allusion I'm going to show you. It's called Samuel Sheppard New, and the reason it's called that is because it fits in to a long series. All of these titles you see there on the left are already up on this channel. Each of them takes a contemporary witness who tells us that William Shakespeare was in fact a pseudonym. Do get cracking on these if you haven't already. The case is effectively closed once you've got through 2, 3 or 4 of them. The corroboration is too much for anyone who is concentrating to think that William Shakespeare was anyone other than the poetical Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. Now, we don't know much about Samuel Sheppard except that he was a poet in the middle of the 17th century. He was probably some sort of Freemason or proto-Freemason. He was also a philologist. Now, a philologist is someone who studies the history and development of language, in particular relation to literature, as well as the relationships between different languages and the changing use of words. Why then am I showing you this book called An Almanac by Merlinus Anonymous? Well, how is it anonymous when it says it's by Raphael Desmus at the bottom? Philologist. Well, obviously Raphael Desmus is a pseudonym, and you only have to jiggle those letters a bit and you find that it's a pseudonym of our friend Samuel Sheppard. He obviously loved anagrams. Here's another book which he dedicated to Philip, Earl of Pembroke, or Earl Philip Herbert as he puts it here, providing an anagram, peer, help, or liberty. Great Lord, we find how well thy name hath suited to thy mind. So he loves anagrams. He seems to know the Earl of Pembroke, to whom the first folio of Shakespeare was dedicated. What else can we tell about him? Well, this little picture on the bottom right shows him effectively swapping his book of poetry for the bays being offered him by Hermes, Mercury. That sort of places him in a sort of world of Neoplatonic Hermetic thought, perhaps. And then you can see that little sign down in the left, which seems to be a kind of triple tau, the symbol that was later used by the Royal Arch Freemasons. I'm not actually going to talk about this book of epigrams. I've already covered the poem in it called Epigram 17, given that number for a reason, in memory of our famous Shakespeare, and that shows that he knew, that Sheppard knew, that Shakespeare wasn't buried at Stratford-upon-Avon but was buried in Westminster Abbey. If you want to see how that's worked out, you need to go to a program on this channel which is called The Freemasons Who Knew Where Shakespeare Was Really Buried. What I want to look at today is another work of his published a little bit earlier, 1646. This is the one that is dedicated to Philip Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke and Montgomery, and it is called The Times, displayed in 6 sestiads. Sestiads are a 6th part, so you can tell he's very interested in numbers, the relevance and symbolism of numbers. We're actually going to look at the 6th part, which is described as Apollo grieves to see the times so pestered with mechanics, lavish rhymes. In fact, if I'm being a bit more precise, what we are going to look at is 4 verses which constitute the 2nd section of the 6th part. And already perhaps some of you are saying, oh, 426, is that a numerical reference to the 426 letters of Earl of Oxford, or indeed Edward de Vere? Well, that's what we're going to find out, whether these 4 verses are specific to Edward de Vere. They certainly mention Shakespeare, so let's go there straight away. This is the beginning of the 6th sestiad, and we start with an italicized argument. The argument just means telling you what the poems you're about to read is essentially about. Apollo rageth that the noble bay is worn by those that do not merit it. So basically we get 6 verses of Apollo in the first person beefing about the rotten state of poetry and how too many poets don't even deserve the name of poet. If you look at verse 5, each fellow now that hath but had a view of the learned Phrygian's fables, that's Aesop's fables, groweth bold, and name of poet doth to himself accrue. That ballad maker too is now extolled with the great name of poet. So according to Apollo, the very name of poet should be reserved only for the very best. In fact, when we get to the next section, which begins in verse 7, we are going to find out that an unnamed poet, described only as the bard, is actually the only one who deserves the name of poet. Although this second section here does praise other poets, but there's only one bard who is unequalled according to Sheppard. Now what I'm going to do is turn the page and manipulate the image a bit. So I'm going to take that verse 7 and put it on top of the next 3 verses so you can see them all together, all 4 together, because they do seem to form a part of a group. Just before I do that, I would like to show you something a bit commonplace and boring. You can see I've ringed a number of proper nouns here, names, which are all in italics, and that is perfectly normal to do that. In fact, all books of that time seem to do exactly that same thing. So why do I bother to highlight it? Well, once we go over the page, you can see that we do indeed have proper nouns done in that same way, done as italics, but something else quite interesting suddenly crops up in verses 9 and 10. We have a new orthography, sort of italicized fancy capital letters for Euripides, Sophocles, Shakespeare, Aristophanes and Edwards. The question is, why has he used a different orthography for these? Why not just carry on using italics? Just before we go there, let's start at the beginning of this section and this odd little bit about the bard, this unnamed poet. Although the bard, whose lines unequalled, who only did deserve a poet's name, to my eternal grief be long since dead, his lines forever shall preserve his fame. Now, this poem names a lot of poets, including Daniel Spencer, Sidney, Johnson, Drayton, Hayward, Davenant, Beaumont, Massinger, etc., etc., etc. Why do we have to have one who is not named, who is just called the bard? Who is this secret fellow? What can we tell about him? Well, this verse goes on to talk about Samuel Daniel. He says, so his who did so near his footpaths tread. That's Daniel. So I think that gives us a sense that this unnamed bard is at least a Tudor poet, and he's unequalled. Yes, he's called the bard. Well, to us nowadays, if you say the bard, you mean William Shakespeare. But if he's talking about William Shakespeare, why isn't he naming it? Could this be, in fact, the earliest, or one of the earliest, references to Shakespeare as the bard? We learn that he is unequalled. Well, certainly nowadays, if we think of Shakespeare, we tend to think that he is unequalled. He's by far the greatest writer of the English language. Who only did deserve a poet's name, to my eternal grief be long since dead. Well, that makes sense. This was published in 1646. Certainly Shakespeare was long since dead, if Shakespeare is being referred to here. Who only did deserve a poet's name. Now, we've seen how Samuel Sheppard rather takes pleasure in anagrams. Is it possible that he's leaving us a little clue here to De Vere's in the word deserves? It is, of course, a perfect anagram, and De Vere's a poet's name. Remember, he said that all these people do not deserve a poet's name, but De Vere's a poet's name, certainly. His lines forever shall preserve his fame. I've italicized his lines there in my transcription to the left, because it seems to me that he's not giving us his name. So what he's saying is his lines that will preserve his fame. And that's something very much that comes out of William Shakespeare's sonnets, of course, when Shakespeare says, my verse is my monument, but my name be buried where my body is. So once again, everything seems to be pointing to Shakespeare. And we are told, of course, that forever his lines shall preserve his fame. Well, we only have to look up the word for to know that there could be a little game going on here. In place of, instead of, forever. Is he saying in place of evere, his lines shall preserve his fame? In other words, his name shall be buried where his body is, but his lines will preserve his fame. Now, as you can see already, we're whipping ourselves up into a state thinking that Edward de Vere, the concealed poet, is being alluded to in these first 4 lines. And I can hear the Stratfordianists among you howling with pleasure and joy to say, ah, brilliant, we've got you, War, because if that bard at the top is Edward de Vere, then he cannot be Shakespeare, can he? Because 2 verses later we have Shakespeare, who's named separately, so Sheppard seems to be thinking he's a different person. Not only that, we are told that the bard, who you're telling us is Edward de Vere, is unequalled, and yet you go down to the verse on Shakespeare there, and you can see that we are told that Euripides doth equal Shakespeare. So, ha ha ha, Shakespeare cannot be Edward de Vere, can he, if that bard at the top is Edward de Vere? Well, this is where we get into the world of this strange orthography and the reason why Euripides has been written in that very peculiar way, and it's not just a normal italic word. Now, how can one equal Euripides in any sense other than a literary one? Well, if you are a philologist like Sheppard, you know Euripides was anciently a number. Here you can see an old book which talks about the number of that game was 40 and the game called Euripides. Euripides numerum continebat quadragenarium. If you know your Latin, you'll know that that means Euripides, the name Euripides, contained the number 40. This has been known for many years to many scholars, and it's all about a game called Euripides, in which the throw called Euripides, the throw of the dice, was 40. Goes right back to the 4th century BC. A throw which totaled 40 was called Euripides in games of astragaloi, or knuckle bones. So you threw your dice, you got 40, and you shouted Euripides. Euripides equals 40. If you're familiar with the presentations on this channel, you will know that Edward de Vere is very often characterized by the numbers 1740, or represented by the number 1740, and it'll come as no surprise to you that see him at the beginning of that line of verse 9 is of course the 17th line of the section. So we have 1740 representing our friend Edward de Vere. Now, if you're new to all this, you may think I've gone completely nuts at this point. If you're not new to it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, and it derives right back from 1570 when John Dee, the Queen's conjurer, writes, "May we be led upward toward the conceiving of numbers absolutely, that at length we may be able to find the number of our own name gloriously exemplified and registered in the book of the Trinity, most blessed and eternal." I'm not in this programme going to go into how it is that 1740 aligns the name of the Earl of Oxford to the Blessed Trinity. I have done that already in a presentation called John Dee's Secret Patron Revealed, and please look it up if you're interested. What I will look at now, though, is Edward de Vere's signature, and thank very much Christopher Johnson, who persisted, telling me I had to show how the signature itself represents 1740. That's what I'm going to do now. Just at a quick glance, you can see that the signature contains 3 numerical signals. The first one, of course, right in the center is the number 10. That's pretty obvious. Just below that, you have 7 dashes, and just above that, you have 4 dots representing the raised pearls of the Earl's coronet at the top. If you take the 7 dashes, you'll see that they have been drawn onto a line, and on the left-hand side of that line, we have a sign that looks like an and sign. In fact, it's a looped J, which represents the Latin word et, meaning and was used in mathematics, where sometimes a plus sign was not used to mean plus. So you have et, 7, so you've got 10 plus 7, which of course is 17. So already in the signature you can see how he is representing himself as the 17th Earl of Oxford, with the Earl's coronet at the top. The coronet has 4 raised pearls. Normally you would have 5, but he distinctively puts 4, and on all of his signatures he does the same. He's very precise, so he wants that number 4 to be relevant, and then right underneath those 4 pearls you can see in the center of the coronet the letter M. It was not until 1631 that William Orchard devised the cross, the times sign for multiply. Before that, multiply, multiplicatus, was very often represented by the letter M. So 4 multiplied by 10 is, of course, 40. So there you can see this beautiful way, right in the center of Edward de Vere's signature, how he represents his connection to the Holy Trinity with the numbers 1740. And this is something that a lot of people seem to have known about. When you look at the grave of Edward de Vere as it was in Hackney. You can see the 1740 plan on it. Lots of references to Shakespeare go on about this 1740, and the whole thing, of course, culminates in 1740 when the great Shakespeare monument is placed right upon Edward de Vere's grave, with the 17 bars or spears in the front of it and representing 1740 encrypted 4 different ways. I'm just going to take you on a little sidetrack before I come back to the phenomenal unlocking of the Sheppard poem with those weird capital letters, and show you something I've actually only discovered about Ben Jonson's encomium to Shakespeare from the first folio, that he actually uses the numbers 17 and 40 to structure or mark out, if you like, the places where he changes the address from William Shakespeare in the third person, he, him, to William Shakespeare being addressed directly in the second person, thee, thou. So, for instance, you get 17 words in the title where he is in the third person, William Shakespeare, and what he hath left us. Now, that is followed by 40 lines in which Shakespeare is addressed directly in the second person, to draw no envy, Shakespeare, on thy name. And that goes on until line 41, when he changes his address away from Shakespeare and to Britain, starting a new section of 40 lines. Triumph, my Britain, thou hast one to show. Then if you take the 17th line down on that page, he goes away from talking to Britain and goes back to talking to Shakespeare in the second person. Thy art, my gentle Shakespeare, must enjoy a part. The whole poem actually begins on the 17th line, and that distinguishes between the first 16 lines, where he's talking about Shakespeare as known by the common man, Shakespeare the pseudonym, and from line 17, where he's talking about my Shakespeare. I therefore will begin, soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of our stage, my Shakespeare, rise. So from the moment he addresses my Shakespeare, 40 lines on, including the catchword at the bottom, we're back after this little excursion talking to Britain. He says, thy art, my gentle Shakespeare, must enjoy a part. There are a couple of little hidden 17s here as well. If you take 17th line from the bottom, including Ben Jonson as a subscript, look how the father's face lines in his issue, even so the race of Shakespeare's mind. So you can see that 17 marks out the discussion of Shakespeare as him in the third person. And if we go 17 lines down from thy art, where he's talking my gentle Shakespeare, then we get back again to sweet swan of Avon, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear. So you can see how the whole poem has been marked out using 17 and 40s sections that distinguish between the third person he and the second person thou, thee. And of course I know I've already shown you how William Shakespeare works as these 17 letters, Ilium referring to Troy and Shakespeare referring to the spear-shaking goddess of playwrights, Pallas. So you have your 17 letters there, preceded by 2 V's, V being the 20th letter of the Latin alphabet, therefore has a geometric value of 20. 2 V's therefore are 40. So in William Shakespeare, just as you had in the signature of Edward de Vere, you have 1740 embedded. Now that, as you can tell, was a bit of a diversion. So I'm going to go back to the poem, but I hope you get the point and we're interested in some of those new findings about 1740. In Sheppard we have 1740 on this line, and we see that Euripides doesn't mean Euripides, it means the number 40, or at least can also be read to mean that. Now, what about the rest of these italicized capital letters in verse 9? This is where my brilliant friend Dr. Roger Stritmatter comes into it, because he looked very carefully at this, and one of the things he saw was this bizarrely large C in the word Sophocles. And because he's a very clever Oxfordian scholar and not a Stratfordianist, he did not walk away from it and say, oh, that's just a mistake, that's a typographical error. He realizes, as all good Oxfordian scholars do, that these things are very, very often done on purpose, and he wanted to know the meaning of this large C, and said to himself, it looks to me as if what Sheppard's trying to do is tell you that Sophocles should be read as 2 words. Sophos in Greek, sopho, which means clever, that's where we get the word sophisticated from, and kleis, which sounds very identical to the Greek word kleis, kappa, lambda, epsilon, iota, sigma, which means a key. So, and with Sophocles, with clever key, we may compare great Shakespeare Aristophanes. compare, which means to speak of or represent as similar. So let us represent, using the same clever key, the words that are also put in this great capital letters: Shakespeare, Aristophanes. Well, Shakespeare is very obvious and very easy. That divides into two words, English words, shake and spear. No problem there. Aristophanes, we have to go back to the Greek, to the origins. Aristo, of course, big clue. We sometimes sneeringly call people aristos or toffs. It means one who is of the highest birth, or the noblest birth, one of noblest birth. And phanes again comes from the Greek phino, meaning to appear, to be shown, one who is revealed. So what do we have here? We have this sentence: and with Sophocles, and with clever key, we may compare, looking at compare again, to pair together, couple, match, bring together. So we may bring together the English words shake and spear. So one of noblest birth is revealed. Interesting that, isn't it? We're talking, of course, about 1740. One of noblest birth is Edward de Vere. Certainly isn't Stratford Shakespeare. You can't, under any stretch of the imagination, describe him as one of noblest birth. The verse goes on talking about the Prince of Tyre, Pericles and Tarquin, and praising Shakespeare's poems. Now, if we go back to that 4-stanza section, in the knowledge that stanzas 7 and stanzas 9 refer to Edward de Vere, 1740, as Shakespeare, what then are we to make of the intervening stanza, stanza 8? But who's this whose shade before me stands? A question mark, another reference to the same unnamed poet. Whose shade before me stands. He is the one who, of course, is long since dead, and before me stands, that links us also to stanza 9, see him whose tragic scenes Euripides doth equal. So he's connecting up stanzas 7 and 9 by this intervening verse. But who's this whose shade before me stands? Oh, 'tis the man whose fame the earth doth fill. Again, a reference to the eternal fame of verse 7. Whose virtue is the talk of foreign lands, while they admire his feats of arms, his skill in poesy. Well, yes, it can't possibly refer to Stratford Shakespeare, because he has no feats in arms whatsoever. Oxford, of course, first served in the military in 1570 under Sussex, quelling the Northern Rebellion. He must have been pretty good at that, because only 1 year later, in 1571, Giles Fletcher writes of him, the country sees in Oxford both a leader preeminent in war and a skillful man of arms. 4 years later, he's in Italy, where we have reports of his jousting, and in Sicily, very successfully. And in 1585, he's leading 4,000 men into Zeeland. In 1588, of course, he's part of the Armada crisis. So that's what that refers to. While above all, he commands the muses. A very interesting line. Of course, the only person who commands the muses is Apollo. So a direct reference to Oxford as Apollo, as we find many times in Chapman, Susan, Nash, and many of his contemporaries refer to him as Apollo. It's a reference to him primarily as a patron. Who so waited on his quill that, like to Sidney. Fascinating comparison of Sidney to the muses who waited on Apollo's quill. And again, this refers and shows Sheppard's enormous knowledge of poetry, referring to Spenser and Thomas Watson, each of whom describes Sidney as one who would listen to the arbitration on poetry from Oxford, one who was subordinate in a sense to Oxford as a poet in his lifetime. None e'er wrote before his birth, nor now he's dead shall e'er write more. Well, that's just telling us once again that he is unequalled. So that 8th verse unquestionably links us to the Bard of the 7th and to Shakespeare in the 9th. So that takes us very quickly and finally to the 10th verse, which is all about Michael Drayton, as you can see from the side notes there. Drayton being the poet who wrote a work called Polyolbion. So what if this is about Drayton? Has this Edwards got to do, and why is it there in that very special font, that special orthography that we associated with Euripides, Sophocles, Shakespeare and Aristophanes? Well, in each of those we realised that the word was not what we thought it was. It was typed in this particular way to make us think and to get the other meaning. Euripides was 40, Sophocles was the clever key, Shakespeare, and then Aristophanes, which led us to the appearance of the one of most noble birth. So you can very quickly guess what is meant when he says, "Thou who so sweetly Edward's woes hast told." He's talking to Drayton, and he's not talking about Edward II, which you assume he's talking about, because Drayton wrote this Piers Gaveston, Earl of Cornwall, but he has this double meaning. He's talking about Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, and as I've explained before, this poem, Piers Gaveston, Earl of Cornwall, is alluding to Edward de Vere. So the King Edward is very much in the thrall, enraptured by the young Piers Gaveston, just as Edward de Vere was by the young Henry Rosalie. And there's a bit of satire basically going on in this Drayton poem at the expense of Edward de Vere. And the verse finishes off, "When other poems, though of worth decays, thine shall be honoured, and shall I subsist, in spite of dark oblion's hiding mist." You probably think I read that wrongly, and I should have said oblivions. I suspect that Sheppard wants you to think of the word oblivions, but look at the word oblions. We know how much he loved anagrams, and it is, of course, an anagram of Olbion. So, in spite of dark Olbion's hiding mist, he's referring to Drayton's poem, Polly Olbion. If we had time, we could look at Song 16 of that poem, in which there is a rather obscure conversation that goes on between the stream called Vere and Watling Street. And this is hiding Edward de Vere once again in a poetical mist. And that is what he is talking about. That was a lot, I suspect, to digest, but I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've understood it. I hope you will press buttons that say you want to subscribe and little bells that will tell you next time I upload something, because the great push goes on. Edward de Vere has been unmasked as the poet behind the pseudonym William Shakespeare. Thank you very much indeed for watching.